Hello, my name is Hans Vollaard. I'm from Leiden University, the Netherlands, and today I want to talk about European disintegration, how the European Union might fall apart. According to Walter Hallstein, the first president of the European Commission in the 1950s and the 1960s, European integration resembles cycling. If it does not move on, it will fall over. If the European Union is not in a constant forward motion, it will fall apart. I like the metaphor of cycling. In the end, cycling is one of the most important means of transportation in the Netherlands, my country. But is it the right metaphor? Will the European Union fall apart if it does not move on? No, said Volker Kauder, the leader of the Christian Democrats in the lower chamber of the German parliament, the Bundestag. In a piece in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in 2009, he argued that after a period of large-scale changes, such as EU enlargement, the introduction of the euro, the European Union requires a phase of consolidation. A phase of consolidation that offers the European Union the opportunity to strengthen the trust of its increasingly Eurosceptic citizens. Right at the moment Kauder stressed the need for consolidation, the problem of private and public debts arose in the Eurozone. And soon after, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Cyprus required support to prevent them from full bankruptcy. The debt crisis have led to a lot of speculations about European disintegration, from a Grexit, the exit of Greece, to a split between the northern and the southern Eurozone, and even the complete breakup of the Economic and Monetary Union, and even the European Union itself. In sheer contrast with these speculations, European integration has moved on in recent years and quite radically. Perhaps too slow, but the European Union adopted a series of far-reaching measures to contain the current euro crisis and to contain the risk of a new debt crisis. Moreover, the European Union welcomed Croatia as its 28th member state in 2013. This would fit well with Hallstein's bicycle metaphor. As long as European integration moves forward, it will not fall over. But according to Kauder's way of thinking, continuing European integration would further estrange citizens from the European Union. That discussion about moving on and consolidation boils down to the questions of what makes the European Union stick together? And what are the causes of European disintegration? What explains European disintegration? And that's the key question of today's talk. The area of EU studies would seem to be the most obvious place to look for answers to the question of what explains European disintegration. Surprisingly, however, the issue of European disintegration has been rather neglected in the area of EU studies. Just take a look at these overviews of EU theories. They include theories explaining the integration of states in the European Union, theories explaining the way the European Union functions and the policies it produces, theories explaining how the European Union impacts on its member states and on the rest of the world. But there are no theories explaining how the European Union might disintegrate. Also, in these more recent overviews, you can't find the word European disintegration in its index. Yes, a lot of studies exist about Euroscepticism and enlargement, but they hardly reflect upon the possibility of European disintegration. Flexible or differentiated integration has also attracted a lot of attention in scholarly literature, explaining why some member states do not participate in all further integrative steps. But it does not explain whether the European Union could become less integrated. In order to find an answer to the question of what explains European disintegration, I'll do the following in my talk. First, I discuss the few contributions that do discuss European disintegration specifically. And second, I compare the European Union with other political formations that disintegrated, such as federations and empires. In the end, the European Union would not be the first multinational, multi-level formation that falls apart. The remarkable fact is that European integration has taken place at a time disintegration has been much more common. Think of the colonial empires, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, Canada, Indonesia, Spain, the United Kingdom, Italy. The only 3 instances of large-scale political integration that I know in recent history are Vietnam, Yemen, and Germany. But the advantage of the many cases of disintegration is that they offer the opportunity to find out the crucial factors explaining the viability of multinational, multi-level political formations, such as the European Union. So, in my talk, I can discuss a number of explanations of European disintegration. Explanations derived from structural realism, explanations based on the perspective of optimum currency areas, derived from comparative federalism, and derived from theories of imperial decline. For each explanation, I present the crucial factors, the expected outcome, and the likelihood of European disintegration. Second, I point at problems of each of these explanations. And third, I reflect upon the policy advice that could be derived from these explanations. Should the EU move on to prevent it from disintegration, or should it rather consolidate now? I should emphasize, I just give short introductions to and reflections on these explanations. My aim is to help you to start thinking about the causes, outcomes, and likelihood of European disintegration. I refer to a number of books and articles that you can use to dig deeper into the subject of European disintegration from a particular perspective. One of the first explanations of European disintegration has been presented by John Mearsheimer already in 1990. His explanation is based on structural realism. That also holds for a more recent account of European disintegration by Sebastian Rosato. They both expect the European Union to fall apart into states again. As you may remember from your classes on international relations, structural realism considers sovereign states as the key players in international politics. They have no power above them. As a consequence, they have to care for themselves in order to survive. They cannot trust their fellow states because there is no supranational power that can force them to cooperate. Nevertheless, cooperation between states is not impossible according to structural realism. States might cooperate by forming a coalition to counterbalance the common threat from another state. But as soon as this threat disappears, cooperation will end. Furthermore, when a state is powerful enough, it can also enforce cooperation among states and repress mutual distrust and conflicts among states. If a great power is no longer able or willing to do so, cooperation will end. So, how could the end of cooperation in the European Union be explained according to these structural realists? Mearsheimer expected in 1990 that the Soviet Union and the United States of America would withdraw the troops and arms from Europe after the end of the Cold War. As a result, these great powers would no longer be able to pacify and control the European states. Re-emerging distrust would subsequently undermine European cooperation, with security competition, arms races among the larger European states, France, Germany, Russia, as the most likely scenario. Later on, Mearsheimer had to explain why Europe has yet remained peaceful and why cooperation did not collapse until now. Against his expectations, the American superpower has stayed in Europe and has even expanded its influence by the enlargement of NATO in Eastern Europe. The American superpower is still powerful enough to provide protection against potential external threats, such as Russia, but also to prevent conflicts among NATO and EU member states. But as soon as Europe would be no longer a security interest of the United States, the end of cooperation will be inevitable. For his part, Rosato perceives the overwhelming Soviet threat as the main reason for European states to start cooperating after the Second World War. The tight cooperation between European states can be explained by their wish to encounter that overwhelming Soviet threat as effective as possible, and to prevent any member state to dominate another. That need to counterbalance the Soviet threat disappeared after the collapse of the Soviet Empire in the early 1990s. Since there has been no other threat to the member states of the European Union, re-emerging emphasis on national interests and the EU's disintegration into states would be the likely outcome. These explanations of European disintegration do have some problems though. Contrary to their expectations and their predictions, European integration has continued, even at higher pace, since the fall of the Soviet Empire. Is that just because of the pacifying role of the Americans? Is it just a matter of security? Or do growing trust among the democratic states in the European Union, as well as supranational institutions or economic independence, matter too? Shouldn't these other factors be taken into account into an explanation of European disintegration? In addition, the realist assumption of sovereign states being the key actors in international politics leaves Mearsheimer and Rosato no other option than to expect the European Union to disintegrate into states again. But why? Why would the European Union disintegrate into states again, when it has digressed from the template of sovereign state for several decades? Two lessons could be learned from this. One, national states are not necessarily the only possible outcome of a process of European disintegration. Instead, even if states leave the European Union, a core group of member states could stick together. In addition, the European Union could also dissolve fully or partly into a globalizing world, or in an American empire light, through a reinvigorated NATO and the new transatlantic trade union. And lesson 2 follows logically from this. Disintegration, it is not necessarily the integration of states in reverse. To conclude this part on structural realism, what would keep the European Union alive? Is it moving on with European integration, or is it consolidation? From a structural realist point of view, that doesn't really matter. Without a common thread, European cooperation exclusively depends on what the American superpower is doing, providing security in Europe or not. The euro crisis has been one of the main reasons to discuss the sustainability, if not the end, of the economic and monetary union and even the European Union itself. Even before the launch of the economic and monetary union in the late 1990s, Harvard professor Martin Feldstein foresaw in a piece in Foreign Affairs a rise of disintegrative conflicts on economic policies within the European Union. The perspective of the Optimum currency area has informed many contributions on the fate of the euro currency area. This perspective of optimum currency areas indicates the economic preconditions under which it would be beneficial for countries to give up monetary independence and to join a monetary union. It suggests that if the economic structures of the member states do not resemble each other sufficiently, external shocks and one single monetary policy will impact differently across the monetary union's area. The member states would suffer from asymmetric shocks. Mobility of labor migration and mobility of capital, mutual budgetary support and flexible prices and wages may yet be sufficient to absorb these asymmetric shocks. The perspective of the optimum currency area may indicate why the Eurozone would face more difficulties than the United States of America, another currency area. In the end, the American federal budget can much more easily absorb asymmetric shocks than the tiny EU budget. This perspective may also indicate why peripheral countries, such as Greece, fit less into the current economic and monetary union. It may also indicate why diverging economic structures may aggravate the EMU's problems. It could thus also give an answer to the question whether European integration should move on or should consolidate. More European integration seems to be necessary to absorb the asymmetric shocks by stimulating labor migration and introducing mutual budgetary support. Nevertheless, the optimum currency area perspective also faces problems to explain disintegration. It cannot fully explain of what has been foremost a political project. European countries had, of course, economic reasons, but also political reasons to participate in the economic and monetary union, such as the control of reuniting Germany. Furthermore, the optimum currency area perspective cannot sufficiently explain the disintegration of a monetary union. In the end, monetary unions that have not met the preconditions of optimum currency areas have also survived. And even if restoring formal monetary independence would be beneficial according to the optimum currency area perspective, the American economist Barry Eichengreen argued that defection costs, political defection costs, may prevent members from leaving the EMU. Think in this regard of the technical complexities of reintroducing a national currency or the reputational damage among fellow member states. As scholars such as Tal Sadeh and Amy Verden argued, the EMU's sustainability is rather dependent on political factors, such as continuing support from France and Germany, and the underrepresentation of losers within the economic and monetary union. The optimum currency area perspective made us point at some crucial factors that can promote the survival or dissolution of the EMU. It does not fully explain the multi-causal process towards a fully fledged fiscal union, a smaller Eurozone, a split between a northern and a southern Eurozone, or a full-scale collapse of the EU. The theoretical lesson to be learned here is that, similar to structural realism, monocausal explanations do not suffice to account for the complex process of European disintegration. Comparative analysis of other multinational or multi-level systems can be a fruitful source to explain European disintegration. In the end, many federative entities experienced or still experience disintegrative challenges. Think of Yugoslavia or Canada, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and so on and so forth. Studies of failing or fragmenting federations could help to trace the underlying causes, the dynamics of disintegrating polities and of the European Union in particular. Federalism essentially refers to a deal between member states and a federal center. And that deal lays down a combination of self-rule and shared rule by the member states and the federal center. Comparative federalism seeks answer to the questions such as why do states come together to share power with a newly constituted federal center? And what explains the viability, or sustainability, the durability or the robustness of such a federal deal? William Riker is one of the most well-known scholars of comparative federalism. He perceived a common security threat as a crucial factor for states to come together. And already in the 1970s, he did not expect the European community to become a federal system, because it lacked, at least in his view, such a common security threat. However, Riker has been criticized for his focus on this common security threat. It appears not sufficient to explain the rise of federal systems in history. Apparently, other factors played a role too, such as economic interdependence or cultural commonalities. A similar argument applies to Riker's claim that political parties operating across the various levels of government are crucial in sustaining existing federations. Parties that operate at the various levels can mediate conflicts between the several levels, and by doing so, they keep the entire system together. But the federative European Union has been functioning for several decades, despite the continuing domination of national parties and non-existing or weak Euro parties. It's therefore likely that other factors determine the EU's disintegration or integration too. The political scientist Daniel Kahneman provides a more comprehensive account of the EU's durability, also from a federalist perspective. He points at a number of safeguards that can prevent the breakdown of a federal deal. These safeguards are aimed to discourage disintegrative behavior, such as secession, non-compliance with the federal deal, or the refusal to share the financial burden of a federal system. And according to Kahneman, these safeguards are self-reinforcing. So, what are these safeguards? Well, first of all, a political one. If member states have a say in federal decision-making, they are less inclined to shirk away from the federal deal and from burden sharing. Then a partisan safeguard. If political parties operate at several levels, they can mediate conflicts between the federal center and the member states. A judicial safeguard, courts correcting violations of the federal deal, and a cultural safeguard, a commitment to common values or a common identity among elites and the ordinary people that can prevent federation to fall apart. In Kahneman's view from 2007, the European Union is built to last. However, the safeguard of pan-European parties that can mediate conflicts between the European Union and the member states is frail. Euro parties have only limited impact on national parties in the European Union, let alone on citizens and voters. They can hardly contain any disintegrative inclination among national parties. Second, the relatively credible option of an EU member state to leave also limits the effect of safeguards to prevent them from secession or non-compliance. And in addition, as long as citizens in the European Union foremost identify with the member states, the emergence of a unifying federal culture that functions as a safeguard against violations of the federal bargain is rather unlikely. A self-reinforcing process away from disintegration is thus fairly weak in the European Union. Even though Kahneman's explanation is more comprehensive than Riker's one, it does take more factors into account. It fails to factor in the external environment of the European Union, whereas this has been considered crucial in other studies of federalism. For example, in a study of the EU's viability by Peter Halten, working at the Uppsala University in Sweden. Peter Halden made an intriguing comparison between the Holy Roman Empire, that existed from 1495 to 1806, the early American Republic from 1736 to 1865, so basically before the Civil War, and the European Union. Halden emphasizes that his comparisons show that external factors are crucial for the viability of the compound European Union. First of all, the United States as external protector of European cooperation. Second, the embeddedness of the European Union in broader Atlantic cooperation. And also the ability of the European Union to shape its direct external environment through enlargement policies. Andrew Glencross, IR specialist at the University of Pennsylvania, also compares the European Union with the American Republic before the Civil War. However, he points at the significance of internal factors. According to Glencross, ambiguity and hybridity on the competences and the goals in the European Union help to preserve the balance between disintegrative and integrative forces. As long as both Eurosceptics and Europhiles can still hope that they can win, or at least feel that they haven't lost in such a fuzzy situation, they will not push for secession or not push for centralization, which might, in the end, evoke secession too. He also suggests to avoid majoritarian politics in the European Union, which would show otherwise clearly who are the winners and who are the losers. In sum, ambiguity keeps the European Union together. As you understand, these studies from a comparative federalist perspective point at a variety of factors that could be relevant for the sustainability and the dissolution of multi-level and multinational systems. As a matter of fact, other studies of federalism offer even more factors such as the commonality of interests, a shared ideology, economic inequalities, economies of scale, and the guarantee of autonomy of the member states. The theoretical lesson that can be drawn from these studies is that the European Union's viability rather depends on a multitude of factors. And the challenge is to denote whether and how which factors would be essential for the survival of a federal system in the processes of integration and disintegration. The practical lesson seems to be that European integration should not necessarily move on continuously, as the safeguards for maintaining the federal deal underpinning the European Union are fairly weak. Particularly, citizens' support for the centre's power in Brussels is rather limited. And this will most probably worsen when the United States of America would no longer function as external protector and the European states have to share the burden of Europe's security themselves. Further centralization of power could overstretch the willingness of the citizens in the European Union to support the European Union. Euro-federalists should, at least from this point of view, rather demand decentralization, devolution, subsidiarity, return of sovereignty, if they like the European Union to survive. So, where can we look for an explanation of disintegration that could link a multitude of factors in a coherent way? As I mentioned before, Peter Halden compared the European Union with the Holy Roman Empire. Europe's history has seen quite a number of empires declining and collapsing, from the old Roman Empire to the Habsburg Empire and the Soviet Empire. And the European Union itself has been described as an empire too, by political scientists such as Jan Zielonka, but also by EU officials such as European Commission President José Manuel Barroso. You can imagine that the British tabloid media immediately associated Barroso's imperial reference to his European power greed. Instead of taking a normative position here, I adopt a strictly analytical point of view. But what can we learn analytically from empire's collapse in the past? The German political scientist Herfried Münkler noted that the formal equality of EU member states clearly contradicts with the asymmetric relationships found within previous instances of empires. But even if empires and the European Union were only remotely similar, comparative examination of empires may offer necessary insights into the processes and factors that can lead to the disintegration of vast, expanding, complex, multi-layered composite systems. Moreover, the concept of empire has the advantage of not suffering from a state bias. It does not consider the sovereign state as the only format of political organization. In one of the few comparative studies of empires, Michael Doyle defines empires as follows. An empire concerns a relationship, formal or informal, in which one polity controls the effective political sovereignty of another political society. So, a relationship in which one polity controls the sovereignty of another political society. And that can be achieved by force, by political collaboration, by economic, social or cultural dependence. An imperial relationship may thus not only emerge by military conquest, but also voluntarily. An imperial center controls not only the external, but also the internal policies of the peripheral entities. A diversity of asymmetric relationships between the center and the peripheral entities marks empires in contrast to the uniformity and equality seen in systems of states. Also, in contrast to the mutual recognition of sovereign states as at least formally equals, the self-conception of empires as having a supreme and universalistic civilization provides the justification to intervene into the peripheral entities to defend or spread its civilization, if necessary, by less civilized means, such as war. An empire is thus intrinsically unbound, and its boundaries are not fixed, but rather fuzzy buffer zones in which central rule gradually fades out. Have a look at the European Union. The say of the European Union in both the foreign and domestic politics of its national peripheral entities, the member states, in the Eurozone, the Schengen area, the European Economic Area, the accession countries and its neighborhoods, and also the EU attempts to project its normative power even further abroad, clearly resembles the radial pattern of authority of empires. According to Doyle, the emergence of an imperial relationship can be explained, one, by the weakness of the peripheral entities, and second, on the strength and attractiveness of the center. The very issue is, of course, what would determine the strength of the center and the weaknesses of the peripheral entities to explain the process of imperial integration and also disintegration. The German historian Alexander Demand showed that at least 210 factors of a very diverse nature have been mentioned in the scholarly literature to explain the decline and fall of just the western part of the Roman Empire alone. And these factors range from moral decadence, ineffective decision-making, distracting Christendom, to barbarian invasions and even climate change. Comparative analysis also point at manifold explanatory factors of imperial survival and decline. such as the effective mobilization of resources by the metropolitan center, the imperial center, such as the armed forces, taxes, or legitimacy. The opportunities for inhabitants of the empire, for social mobility, political participation, and economic prosperity. A widespread sense of unity and the preservation of economic superiority in the face of competing great powers. Similar to explanations of fragmenting and failing federations, studies of imperial decline thus offer a multitude of factors that can lead to disintegration. A theory to explain imperial collapse would quickly become a theory of almost everything, in the words of the political scientist Gary Marx. This overview of theories and comparative approaches shows that a proper explanation of European disintegration should avoid a state bias, should not assume disintegration as just being simply integration of states in reverse, and should provide a comprehensive yet coherent view on how the multitude of factors are interrelated in the process of European disintegration. And that's the challenge of today, for you, for me, for the community of political scientists, to develop such an explanation of European disintegration. But what can we learn from previous empires declining and collapsing? Should the European Union move on, or should it consolidate right now in order to survive? Scholars such as Andreas Osiander and Peter Hartmann have pointed out the resemblance between the European Union and the Holy Roman Empire. Weakly centralized, fragmented, vast, with a variety of political entities and identities. But despite its weaknesses, the Holy Roman Empire lasted for several centuries. So, even if the European Union would remain fairly weak too, it may thus survive for quite some time. The European Union differs in one crucial aspect, at least one crucial aspect, from the Holy Roman Empire. And that concerns the ideal of democracy. The ideal of democracy has much greater appeal today than in the days of the Holy Roman Empire. The democratic ideal of self-determination of a people consisting of equal citizens. And this ideal clearly contradicts the setup of an empire marked by inequality and lack of sovereignty and self-determination. If people would push hard for democracy, the breakup of the European Union is therefore rather likely, since popular sovereignty and equality of citizens is still foremost associated with national states. To put it the other way around, the survival of the European Union would depend on the willingness to refrain from pushing too hard for democratic self-determination. And wouldn't that be ironical for a project that has aimed at preserving and stimulating democracy? Thank you very much for your attention.